Hi, Dr. Marty. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you and welcome to this RSIS Distinguished Public Lecture. This afternoon, we are very happy to have Dr. Marty with us. But let me just open with a few remarks. As World War II was about to end in 1945, nations were in ruin, and the world wanted peace. Representatives of 50 countries gathered at the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco, California, from 25th April to 26th June 1945, 80 years, exactly 80 years from now. And for the 2 months, they proceeded to craft and then sign the UN Charter, which created a new international organization, the United Nations, which it was hoped could prevent another world war like the one they had just gone through. But far from their relevance, conflicts, situations around the world remind us the severe limitation of global security governance. The United Nations Security Council paralyzed by deep geopolitical divide, unable to deliver on its charter-mandated primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Global economics and trade architectures, painstakingly built over decades, now struggle to prove their relevance in the wake of unilateral imposition of tariffs, especially those imposed on the Trump's U.S. Liberation Day. Since 1945, the United States have been the leading champion, underwriter, and guarantor of an open, rule-bound global system under international law. However, it now rejects the logic of multilateralism, including any self-restraint on the exercise of U.S. power and any responsibilities for global leadership and stability. In fact, 4th of February this year, President Donald Trump signed a sweeping executive order with the potential to upend decades of American global engagement. The directive mandates a comprehensive review within 180 days of all current multilateral organizations of which the United States is a member and all international treaties to which it is party. The explicit purpose of this exercise is to determine whether such support should be withdrawn. The clock is thus ticking on the distinctive and momentous aspect of post-1945 American internationalism, the strategic decision by successive Republican and Democrat administration to embed U.S. power in multilateral institutions designed to support a peaceful, prosperous, and just world to facilitate cooperation on global problems. Headwinds against diplomacy and multilateralism are prevalent. There is, however, a potential positive amidst the gloom. The recurring theme during last year, September 2024, U.S. Summit of the Future, and the Assembly and the general debate on the UN General Assembly on the need for reform. But this is precisely a mere potential. This afternoon, we are most privileged to have Dr. Marty to address the following question. What are the primary hurdles in promoting a more effective global response to threat to international peace and security? How can countries outside those encamped within one of the competing geopolitical rivals offer a common response in promoting a more representative and effective global security governance structure and working methods? How can climate conducive be promoted to alter the current negative dynamic for diplomacy and dialogue to be placed right and center in responding to security challenges? What lesson learned can countries in ASEAN and in Indo-Pacific offer to the wider international community on transforming from trust deficit to strategic trust? Dr. Marty was, of course, the Foreign Minister of Indonesia from 2009 to 2014. Prior to that, he served as the permanent representative of Indonesia to the United Nations. He's also the ambassador to the UK and also to Ireland. Within ASEAN, of which I have a great privilege to work with all the ministers, including Dr. Marty, he has been most instrumental in pushing for ASEAN community and was an early advocate of an ASEAN role in the Indo-Pacific through the concept of dynamic equilibrium. Throughout, including as foreign minister, he actively promoted the management and resolution of potential conflict in the region. Within the context of the UN, he served, among others, as the president of the Security Council in November 2007 and led Indonesia's delegation at numerous multilateral negotiations, both within the UN and beyond. He was instrumental in securing Indonesia's ratification of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 2012. He is presently the Asia Society Policy Institute Distinguished Fellow, a member of the International Academic Advisory Committee of the Oxford Center for Islamic Study, the Southeast Asia Advisory Board of the Center of Strategic and International Studies, the Global Advisory Committee of the Jeju Forum, and also the chairperson of the Asia Pacific Leaders Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament. In 2023, in fact, he initiated the Amity Circus, which bring together individuals from the region with extensive policy experience in ministerial and head of governments level, united in their support for diplomacy and dialogue as statecraft. So it's now my great pleasure to invite Pak Marty to the stage to address us. Let's put our hands together. Thank you.
Well, very good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. I am truly grateful that you have all decided to set aside a moment of your time to be with us this afternoon, hopefully to have a productive and enlightening exchanges of views on the issue at hand. I'd like to thank very much Pa Chi Wing Kyong for such a not only kind introduction, but also such an enlightening one as well in providing a framework to the discussion we are about to have. This afternoon, with your concurrence, I'd like to talk a little bit about the state of multilateralism in the current age of fragmentation. It is obviously a subject matter that many of us would be quite familiar with, but I thought I'd like to begin with a couple of disclaimer or footnote, if I may, because there is always a risk of oversimplification when we speak of a subject matter as comprehensive, potentially, as this. The first point I'd like to make is that in recognizing or in identifying the crisis, for want of a better term, that multilateralism today is facing, I am not at all suggesting that all is doom and gloom. Because thankfully, when we look all around us at the achievements of recent period, we do see occasionally, I'm afraid it's becoming rarer than the norm, of successes when countries put all their efforts in a concerted fashion. In other words, when we speak of a crisis, we must at the same time acknowledge there have been important achievements made even in recent years. 3 events perhaps are of note in recent years. The UN Summit for the Future that was convened at the UN headquarters last September. The Pact for the Future that 193 member states of the United Nations were able to align on. Essentially a commitment, a determination to push for reform of the UN. It's a commitment that cannot be underappreciated. The pandemic agreement that was achieved only a few weeks ago out in Geneva, although with the notable absence of the United States, that's their own doing and their own choosing, but it's also an agreement that is of important and significant note. The agreement on marine biological diversity, the so-called High Seas Agreement that Singapore played an especially important role in helping usher in. In other words, I think while we speak of a crisis, we must not lose sight of the fact that even amidst the current fragmented situation, there are successes. Nor must we ignore the fact that perhaps away from the limelight and publicity, we have officials and individuals working in earnest in avoiding conflict, because sometimes when conflict are avoided, not much known about it, but the efforts put in is equally substantial and significant. In essence, yes, the multilateral system is in a crisis, but at the same time we must acknowledge where successes have been achieved, notwithstanding. The second footnote I'd like to suggest at the beginning is the reality that when we speak of multilateralism, we are speaking of all manner of cooperation. Essentially, anything beyond bilateral can arguably be defined as being multilateral, although nowadays we've begun to use the term minilateral to refer to a smaller group of interstate cooperation. But whether it be the scope, whether it be sub-regional, regional, or global, from the type like ASEAN, global all the way to the United Nations, or whether it be functional, in terms of differentiation based on themes, on topics. Clearly, when we speak of multilateralism, we can speak of a diverse range of situation. I wish to put those two footnotes at the beginning so that I don't run the risk of oversimplifying what I'm about to suggest. Because I think all of us can have a reasonable appreciation or impression that ours is a period where multilateralism is facing severe tests, especially severe tests of relevance. Each and every one of us in this room can describe in far more eloquent and extensive way than I possibly can to remind us of the various ills and ailments of our time, of conflicts left unabated, of the climate crisis, the pandemic that we had just gone through. But essentially, in all this situation, the question that arises is there a multilateral response to this? Is the United Nations, for instance, is it seen to be relevant? When we look at this on our screen, images and situations such as in the Middle East, or efforts at peacemaking on Ukraine, who are the actors? Is the conventional multilateral organizations that we normally look towards, are they being empowered? Are they being relevant? And I think even the most cursory of impressions would tend to remind us that we can do better. The multilateral system can do better in addressing some of these issues. Sometimes the silence can be extremely deafening. At best, at most, we often see multilateral organizations simply providing a running commentary to what is happening all around us. Expression of concern. At most, some semblance of protest. But emotion is not policy. We have no need for policymakers, for people who can make a difference, to simply express how they feel. We are in dire need for actions, for sense of relevance from all these multilateral efforts. Having said what I said, that there is no one size fits all, it therefore naturally follows that the solutions to be offered will also depend on the forum that we speak of. But at the same time, I think in a forum of this type, it is still possible to identify some of the key dynamics at play, the headwinds that we are facing, multilateralism is facing in general, so that once we identify the dynamics, perhaps we can begin to think about the solutions. And especially I think for people like me, who is very much enjoying the paucity of my policy-making responsibility, we can ponder and wonder about problems. But for policymakers, I think their remit is less to do with describing problems, but it's about offering solutions. So taking advantage of the reality, I'd like to offer some dynamics that I think are of relevance against multilateralism. The first is one that I'm sure all of us, is such a truism, it hardly needs emphasis, that we live in a world of deep fragmentation, of geopolitical tensions and push and pull that clearly is impacting the way the multilateral organizations are functioning. We are seeing a situation where countries are inclined towards unilateral actions in defiance of international norms and principles. But the point I wanted to emphasize is that geopolitical tensions and competitions is actually not a new phenomenon. For people like myself of sufficient vintage, we can recall previous period when geopolitical competition was as fierce and as open and as debilitating as it is today. In my view, the current geopolitical competition is intense, is deep, is divisive, but if you reflect on it and have a longer time horizon, most of the modern period modern period have been marked by such a reality. And yet, in the past, notwithstanding such geopolitical competition, it has not prevented countries coming together to agree to certain basic norms and principles and even agreements. Some of the most groundbreaking international treaties, the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty, so-called, that prevented the militarization of the outer space, all the arms control treaties between the US and the then Soviet Union came during some of the most fiercest period of Cold War competition. So in my book, simply citing geopolitical competition as a factor that cause headwinds to multilateralism doesn't suffice. We need to look elsewhere. What are the current features, especially, that makes impossible multilateral cooperation? Oops, sorry, I'm going backward. Another key feature is how geopolitics are overwhelming and dominating other forms of cooperation. The economy in particular. There was a time, a school of thought that was prevalent, that somehow if we all become economically intertwined, interdependent, we will all behave in a more win-win cooperative way. But I'm afraid that those days are over. In the sense now, geopolitics trump. It triumphs over geo-economic considerations. And we are seeing global common issues become weaponized. So the first point I wanted to make is the point that all of you, I'm sure, can hopefully appreciate as well how the geopolitical competition is undermining multilateral cooperation. But with an important footnote, it doesn't have to be this way. There can be conditions conducive, there can be situations, and we must search for those conditions conducive where, notwithstanding the geopolitical competition, multilateralism, multilateral cooperation can still thrive and can still find traction. Another headwinds that I think not often as well recognized as a geopolitical one is a sense that the current multilateral or governance has become outdated. It doesn't really, many of the multilateral organization doesn't really reflect the current constellation of international conditions. Outmoded, outdated. And therefore, it has a bearing on the credibility of the organization concerned. There was a time when, especially in the context of UN Security Council reform, the suggestion being made that if you have the United Nations to be Security Council far too large, it will impact on its effectiveness, as if there is a magic number that you shouldn't breach before the Security Council becomes ineffective. But I feel nowadays that argument has become a little bit moot, because the current constellation where smaller organizations are meant to be more effective has become eroded, because a lot of these organizations, because they no longer represent the current situation, they lose credibility. There is a sense of trust deficit by the wider international community to these organizations. We are this year commemorating the Bandung Conference, Asia-Africa Conference of 1955, where even then, all the way back in 1955, countries subsequently known as the so-called Global South called for reform of global governance to better reflect the situations prevailing then and even more today. Outdated multilateral governance. This is, to me, debilitating. It undermines the effectiveness of international organizations, multilateral organizations. But perhaps more beyond the more traditional type of deficit there in terms of governance deficit, there is also a bit more wider perspective, international, global. By this I mean that many of the issues at hand nowadays are no longer simply the purview of the traditional nation states. We have actors, stakeholders, other than nation states, whose involvement are critical if the issue at hand is to be managed and resolved. International suggests essentially multilateral system of nation states, but increasingly there are actors other than nation states. The pandemic, I think, was a clear example of how often case solutions are to be found beyond a billiard ball perspective type of a nation state. In other words, a multilateral system of the future must, in my view, recognize that reality. For it's difficult to utter such a sentiment for traditional practitioners, because we are extremely jealous of protecting the monopoly of legitimacy of states. That's why whenever we have international organizations, international gathering, treaty-making exercise, the role of NGOs and other stakeholders are carefully calibrated and carefully limited by nation states. A third point that I wanted to make as a headwinds that I think is not only the monopoly of major powers, is essentially the domestic-driven dynamics. And none of us, countries large or small, are immune from this tendency. This is a characteristic that is not the monopoly of so-called major powers. Increasingly, we have countries whose foreign policy are domesticated. Their views, their commentaries on international developments is determined first and foremost by how they think their electorate would like them to be oriented, rather than actually trying to find solutions, common solutions among nation states. And by the way, all of us, while we are so forceful and so eloquent in pushing and reinforcing our commitment to multilateralism, not one country in the world would like to have their issue multilateralized. If you have internal problem of whatever type, internal, national, bilateral, to be multilateralized is akin to having your issue be demonstrated and put before the court of world opinion. So how do we then speak of having an early warning system? Sometimes there was a commitment by the Secretary General early in his administration of the UN to speak of a search for diplomacy. The idea that to have early warning system to attend to a crisis even before it erupts. But a crisis avoided when the multilateral organizations come in with all the sirens blaring and making such huge noise, cause a great deal of anxiety from the country to be given attention on. So we have to recognize that all of us, while we speak of multilateralism, etc., we are also fundamentally have some issues with the idea that your issue is being multilateralized. And increasingly now, with the age of the change in administration in the United States, there is a notion that the multilateral organization, the UN especially, must do less with more, ideally, but now they're beginning to talk about doing less with less because of resource constraint. Headwinds, as I said, I try to identify those, the geopolitical one, the lack of representativeness of multilateral organizations, the domestic dynamics. These, I think, on the whole, apply to any multilateral organizations. Some of us may say, so what? Who cares, really? Why should we still, given those are the headwinds, why should we try to overcome and address them? To me, it's clear that the multilateral approach is a valuable one, because simply there are issues that cannot be addressed nationally, that defy national solutions, and therefore require cooperative partnership across nations and among nations. Issues that have multifaceted implications, requiring coordinated action by countries concerned. Having said all that, which is normally where I would stop, simply saying where are the problems, but I would like to make some suggestions, if I may, but especially drawing on Southeast Asia's experience. And I think Southeast Asia now has enough portfolio of experience for us to be sharing our own multilateral experience beyond the region. The first one, I think, is the notion to recognize that multilateralism, first and foremost, is a mindset. That leaders and countries must have the requisite outlook, a cooperative mindset that truly there are some issues, like I said before, that defies national solution and instead requires cooperative action. A sense of common ownership and a sense of inclusion, the widening of governance, I think is extremely important. Otherwise, there is a sense of disconnect, lack of sense of participation and attachment to an effort, and as a result, a sense of distance to the effort being made. ASEAN, I think, is a key example of how we are about to admit Timor-Leste as a 10th, 11th member of ASEAN, of how ASEAN's expansion from the original founding member states to include countries that are obviously far, which made ASEAN's diversity even more pronounced, has made the inclusion, the diversity at the same time, the source of its strength. Because we have not been about creating unity through uniformity. It's unity through our diversity. Diversity for ASEAN is a product feature. It's not a product defect. Now, elsewhere in other parts of the world, the expansion of a regional organization, especially in the security domain, can become a dynamic that further divides. But in the case of ASEAN, our widening, 5 to 10, and then our external posture beyond ASEAN have become an issue or a dynamic that actually unites. One part that I'm still struggling is the last point here. Multilateral governance that can manage and adapt to constantly changing dynamics rather than freeze-frame dynamics of eras past or even eras present. Because sometimes when we speak of reform, including especially of the UN Security Council, we say, oh, we need to update it, we need to include country A, B, and C to make it more representative. But because power is constantly evolving and changing, it's dynamics of power, not balance of power, any attempt to freeze frame or capture the reality of one era or one moment will almost automatically, in my view, becomes obsolete. There will always be a country that feels they are being left unfairly outside and not be included in the room. So this is where I think we need a bit more creativity in thinking of how, perhaps through the working methods of a multilateral organization, we can be a bit more adaptive, flexible, allowing to let the form follows the function. There could, on one issue, the constellation of countries that needs to be in the room would be different to another issue. Rather than assume that some 15 members of the Security Council have, especially the 5, unelected members, as if they have monopoly of wisdom to be able to pronounce on all issues of the day in the world, and leave some of us who are actually equally able and actually most affected be left outside the room. So I think this third point is something that I'm still a little bit struggling. If we were in a San Francisco moment today, how would you come up with a governance that has that automatic, elastic capacity? Not cast everything in stone, but flexible. But as I said, I have no idea, but I love thinking about it. I haven't asked AI yet, but I'm not that. But yes, I think it's something that we need to be thinking about. The other one that I wanted to speak of in addressing the headwinds is creating safe spaces. I did speak about how global common issues have become increasingly weaponized by the geopolitical push and pull. And yet, as I began with some examples in the issue of the pandemic agreement, treaty, and other examples, there can be moments when somehow we manage to allow the natural need for cooperative behavior to find traction, to isolate or to insulate these spaces, these critical spaces from being weaponized. And I think this is where countries like Singapore, like Indonesia can play a role. How we can insulate or protect, create safe spaces on global common issues from global fragmentation, whether it be global common issues of a functional type, financial, economic institutions. That's why if I was asked the Bandung Principles, for instance, Asia-Africa Bandung Principles, we need to manifest it in today's conditions. We are not only now in the absence of a Cold War of the traditional type. How can countries occupy that third space to ensure that we can protect and allow cooperation to take hold? A code of behavior, basically. A code of behavior in dealing with global common issues. National, regional, global nexus. I mentioned before about how countries don't wish to have their issues multilateralized. National issues they wish to protect and keep to themselves and not want to be brandished and be projected as being a problem country in the world. But we do need to address this issue, national, regional, and global. Now, I'd like to suggest one alternative way or to a conventional wisdom that I often hear spoken of about ASEAN. It is often said by many learned individuals that ASEAN is so into non-interference, so into protection of national sovereignty, that this has become debilitating to ASEAN for the region to address issues of concern in our region. But if we were to go beyond the rhetorics, to actually look at state practice, not to look at what we say in terms of all the various documents and the allegations being made against us, I honestly feel that Southeast Asia, I'm not using the term ASEAN, has been quite progressive in engaging international partners in preferring multilateral cooperation in addressing national solutions, issues. Indonesia itself, a country that I'm most familiar with, even its own independence, 1945 to 49 especially, was so coupled, was so tied up with the efforts at the United Nations. Physical armed efforts, obviously, but then coupled with the efforts at diplomacy, 45, 49, and then subsequently when the province of Papua joined with Indonesia, even on East Timor when it chose to secede. Indonesia's historical development was always tied with the United Nations. Cambodian conflict, in the 1980s, 1990s, perfectly national in nature with regional ramification. But we in our region found a modality, informal, Jakarta informal meeting, that managed to synergize the national, regional, and global nexus. A potential blueprint that we must look again when we deal with Myanmar today. How is it that at the time, in the 80s, early 90s, without fancy ASEAN community documents, without the ASEAN Charter, but with the requisite type of leadership, we were able to actually bridge, seamlessly go up national, regional, global, national, in a very seamless way and found a solution. I might as well look at the list. Indonesia, on Cambodia, South China Sea workshop process. If we were to begin the South China Sea ASEAN-China process today, I doubt whether we can get it off started. But it began all the way in the late 80s, early 90s from a workshop series that Indonesia initiated, found traction, became an ASEAN thing, ASEAN with China, and then ASEAN, the DOC, etc., etc. Again, multilateral approach, notwithstanding the bilateral problems, the challenges that we have. Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore and Malaysia took our cases to the ICJ. That is to me quite a demonstration of our commitment to the rule of law, to rules-based international order. The Philippines, when they had their problem in the southern Philippines, engaged Indonesia in the case of their disputes with, during the conflict with the Moro National Liberation Front, and then subsequently also with Malaysia and Brunei with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Again, purely domestic, but they opened their door. Please help us out. Indonesia, again, we have many examples, to be frank. I could give you far more examples on Indonesia because we are quite, we have enough template, enough issues to share. But on Aceh, again, after the tsunami, 2004, we engage our neighbors to please come and observe the peace agreement. Again, East Timor, I mentioned before, when separation was to be implemented, we asked our neighbors to be part of the UN operations in East Timor. The border disputes between Thailand and Cambodia, by the way, it seems to be back again. It was, right? It was in 2011 when things happened, immediately we went at it. ASEAN went immediately. It's been quite a few days now, simmering. I'm not sure what the intentions of the current ASEAN family would be. Is this something that ASEAN wish to express their view on, or would they wish to simply attend to other issues? But again, this was also an example of ASEAN and Myanmar, notwithstanding the current impasse and situation, was also an example of how domestic, national, regional, and global nexus was smoothly traversed by ASEAN countries. In other words, the point that I wanted to make, and this I will end here, and I hope we can have a conversation, is that on all those headwinds that I mentioned, the geopolitical, the domestic constraints, the lack of representation, actually Southeast Asia has a script. we went through some of those issues. We are still going through them, and we have had a script that has worked well for us. And perhaps as we are now very much in a thinking out aloud mode, I hate to see a situation, so-called UN 80, I think, the term is being used now, UN 80 reform, is if it simply becomes a cost-cutting exercise, driven by the reality that resources are limited, and therefore they simply trim the budget of, for example, the UN, and basically create a miniature, a streamlined version of the same situation. So I think this is a very critical time for countries, including here in Southeast Asia, to come up with their blueprint. Since we are at it, while we are engaged in some kind of a reform effort, let's make sure we get it right. We offer our thoughts, our thought leadership on these sort of issues. Otherwise, it will be old wines in new bottle. More of the same, except it looks accounting exercise. It simply looks more efficient, but it doesn't address those issues that I had mentioned before. ASEAN, Southeast Asia especially, have had an answer to each of those. The geopolitical, the domestic external, the issue of representation, to make sure everyone is on board. When those critical moments when ASEAN expanded, of course there will be those who say, oh, this will make things more complicated because they even make ASEAN even more diverse. But it's best to have variation under one roof rather than have a perfectly functioning and efficient organization that's tight and small, but you have a lot of people outside the fence looking in and having a sense of dissatisfaction. Those are the points that I wanted to say, Pa, and I hope we can have a good conversation. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
That you raise your hand, and as well as give your name and the organization you're from. And please keep the question or remark short so that more people can participate in this Q&A. Yes, please.
Alex Arifianto from RSIS. Pak Marty, thank you for your interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I think my question for you is the current age has frequently been described as the age of minilaterals, where many group of nations forming smaller minilaterals, whether it's in economy or security front, and people talk about the advantages of minilaterals as being more faster in making decisions. How do you see minilaterals with traditional multilateral institutions? Do you see them always conflicting each other, or can and would minilaterals work together with traditional multilaterals to solve the problem of global public good that we often have? Thanks.
Maybe we take another one or two questions and then Marty can address that. This gentleman down here.
Thank you. Francesco Mancini with the Lee Kuan Yew School at NUS. We were in New York at pretty much the same time. I was the director of the International Peace Institute, and I remember having conversation around the time that Ban Ki-moon was trying to reform the UN. And so my question is, we kind of all know what needs to be done, But the challenge, particularly in New York, but also in Geneva and other places, is always the how, right? How do we actually get there? And I wanted to probe you a little more in your good ideas at the end that you suggest us to this flexible setting, right? I was wondering if the principle of subsidiarity that the European Union uses sometimes, kind of creating multiple speed of multilateralism, where depending on the issue you have like-minded states coming together. We've seen that in UN sometimes. And maybe is the time to have a new Bandung conference. Maybe it's the time to have some kind of Big Bang event where like-minded states, which might be even a smaller group, push for some of this reform. I wanted you just to have a little more on your thinking. Thank you.
Maybe we take one more questions before Marty. And I think there's a gentleman behind.
Thank you, Dr. Marty, for that very insightful presentation. My name is Kaiser. I work for RSIS. My question is, despite being founded on principles such as inclusivity and cooperation, you've got key multilateral organizations who have been consistently criticized for reinforcing global power imbalances. The World Trade Organization, for example, has been criticized for having their green room, which sidelines smaller states. Similarly, the leadership of the IMF and the World Bank has always been traditionally underpinned by a gentleman's agreement, an American leader and a European bank president. So my question really is, how can small states realistically challenge the status quo of this legacy structures and informal power sharing in such institutions, especially in times of geopolitical tension or global crises? Thank you.
Before I forget the questions, yes, thank you for all that questions. To be frank, as I was taking note of the questions, I have to view it not only as questions, but also as comments in a way. It alert me to some issues that needs to be further thought of. The unilateral relationship with so-called multilateral, again, I think this would fall within the context of what I said before, that there is not one size fits all. In my practice in the past, since I view that unilateral has become essentially inevitable, is a trend that is impossible to curtail, the efforts should be to ensure synergy that between the unilateral and the multilateral of a regional type, bigger type, that there is always a sense of synergy and coherent team. More than the actual size between unilateral and regional multilateral or global multilateral, I'm more concerned about the themes, the issue at hand. For instance, we've had unilaterals in this part of the world for many decades, but the unilaterals of the recent era, whether it be formal or assumed informal, they are of a particular type which I'm a little bit concerned about, because they tend to be of truly like-minded, very strong core, like-minded countries requiring a common enemy to identify themselves as a one group. This type of unilateral I find for Asia Pacific to be quite a source of concern, because in this part of the world, ASEAN's approach has always been of inclusion. So having diversity in a group, that's why I'm not a big fan of the term like-minded, because it tends to put us in a silo conversation among the converted. And so rather than the distinction between unilateral and multilateral in terms of size, I am more looking at what is it that binds these countries together. Is the perspective inclusive, common security, or is it collective security? More of that type. That is why, for instance, and this doesn't have to be on security issue alone, even on the tariffs, for instance, on the issue of the recent tariffs issue. I recall, we can all recall, in Asia Pacific, there are so many processes apart from ASEAN and the ASEAN pluses. We have the RCEP and we have the various sub-region organizations like BIM-EAGA and etc. All of them deal with trade issues. And what's needed is actually the common script. What are the by ASEAN member states, for instance, following their summit just now in Kuala Lumpur, the same mindset can be brought to the different forum and be propagated and be promoted rather than unilateral versus, because unilateral will occur irrespective. So I think the mindset shouldn't be to try to stem and prevent this, but try to make sure that there is a synergy. But what I did say, that the unilateral that I would be most concerned about is of the type that sort of like create division, further amplify division. I think the jury is still out in the security domain, for instance. Is the risk, the challenge in the Asia Pacific, the security challenge we are facing, is it one of deterring aggression? So we assume that there are some countries in this part of the world that are, about to engage in traditional cross-border aggression, for which we must deter? Or is the risk essentially one of unintended conflict, of miscalculation? At the moment, I feel more of the second type, that what we must be guarding first and foremost is one of unintended small crisis escalating to become a bigger one, and then suddenly more of the First World War rather than the Second World War type. So that's why when the recent conference held here in Singapore was talk about deterrence, etc., I'm a little bit not too comfortable with that, because I feel it sort of augment a divisive type of architecture. But unilateral and multilateral, they don't have to be in conflict, but more than the numbers involved, I think it's more the issue. What are the issues at hand? Our colleague, yes, on the issue of we know what needs to be done is the how, precisely right. I mean, I was going through the general statement, the statement made during the general debate of the last October-September UN, and as more of the ASEAN member states. All of them, practically all of them, made references to the need for UN reform. Everyone says it, which is a great source of encouragement. But how to get it done, and perhaps how do you get it? What needs to be done? That has been a perennial issue, because I feel, on the one hand, those who are already advantaged by the current status quo, why should they engage in an exercise of self-denial, right? So they're already comfortably cocooned. They say, why should we bother? Those who are aspiring, they don't agree between themselves. Who should be in and who should be out? I have a few months ago, there was a little discussion in Jakarta on the Bandung conference, when we talked about, even amongst the so-called non-aligned states, Asia, African countries, can we agree among ourselves who should be in and who should be out when we speak, for instance, of the UN Security Council? So this is we know already that this is quite a thankless task. That is why I find that governance, the one that I speak of, that has an automatic adaptive capacity, is quite a useful way of thinking, like a halfway point, because there is no permanence to it. Because if you are trying to, okay, who's going to be the next veto-wielding permanent member states, it's so terminal, it's so final, once you're in forever, right, basically. So it makes countries so unable to think in a flexible way. But if we think about promoting the idea of a flexible arrangement where countries come and go dependent on the issue, then perhaps we can liberate, then we can see who actually make a difference. What countries actually can make a difference in terms of solving, because I think the permanent members of the UN Security Council are permanent and have additional responsibility on behalf of the rest of the international community. It's not like a freebie. You can just go in and that's it, enjoy your permanence. But yes, this is a perennial issue. Like-minded states, as I suggested before, I have a footnote on that. There have been, for Indonesia, there have been many moments when we could have joined a like-minded this, like-minded that, but our instinct is always to say, oh, no, we shouldn't, because we don't want to magnify and burn bridges. We would rather not declare our commonality in a permanent way, because we want to maintain our ability to be building bridges. But we have to know where those gaps are, right? But our last colleagues is about, which was the question?
Small state.
Huh?
How do small states?
Yes, yes. Or small states. Well, first of all, I'm not a big fan, especially in a formal setting, relatively formal setting, to differentiate countries by small, middle, or large. I actually purposefully always use the term so-called major powers, so-called superpowers, because they are it is a terminology that is self-perpetuating and self-serving by countries who wish to self-define themselves as being important. So I think, in my view, especially since nowadays, power as an instrument, currency as to effect outcome, is so multifaceted. It doesn't simply depend on the size of your population, the size of your country, physically, geography, but it's the quality of your diplomacy, the ability to. So, first of all, I think we should, we work very hard, all of us at the UN, whenever we have documents, to make sure that there is always a principle of sovereign equality of nations, right? So we shouldn't, I think, engage in any effort anything that actually amplify a stratified international order. But to the main question, yes, you're quite right. This is increasingly the case where countries feel that they are being left out of discussion on issues during the time that I was at the UN twice, during which Indonesia served at the Security Council, the level of informality, issues that are being discussed, decisions made outside the Security Council proper, has become far more magnified. There used to be an informal consultation room and the formal room. But now you have the informal meeting taking place in informal. And there's someone who's meant to be the pen holder. Who's that pen holder? Why should, there is someone, there's apparently, I've been out of the UN for many decades, obviously. I'm not not privy to the latest, but I came across this notion of a pen holder. So on any issue in the Security Council to do with situation A or B, the pen holder is what country? Why? Of course, in the end, the pen holder tends to be the permanent members because they're there all the time. This is the type of thing that we need to break through. That's why I said we need to think about, short of having General Assembly, it's a General Assembly, but we need to think of working methods that's more democratized. You talk about democracy mainly as an internal within state phenomenon, but it can also be between states. And here I think we have to earn that role. Singapore, I mentioned before, to my recollection, you played a huge role in in the facilitation of the agreement on the RSIS thing, right? And you played a role as well in the agreement on mediation as well. So these are, I think, examples where so-called small powers, and I don't wish to prescribe that title on anyone, including Singapore, can actually play a great role, a greater role than they would normally be expected to play. But we need to, and by the way, this is not only on the interstate issue, but also within the secretariat of a lot of this organization. Because sometimes, not sometimes, it is, the impact of permanent member of the UN Security Council resonate and find its expression elsewhere. There are conventions and customs that this post is secured for national of that permanent member. This post is for national of that other permanent. So if you have a new set of permanent member states to the UN Security Council, the impact will not remain only in the Security Council. It will reverberate and have consequence beyond the Security Council itself. So this is something I think we must offer an idea. How can we democratize the decision-making process? Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Yes, I think the gentleman and followed by you.
Thank you, Pak Marty. I'm Johannes from CNA Digital. I would like to ask, recently Prime Minister Lawrence Wong said that ASEAN faces a moment of truth to step up on integration or risk losing relevance. Would you like to comment on that and perhaps provide some examples on what aspects or what areas that you think ASEAN should be working on right now? Thank you.
Can you repeat your question again?
The moment of truth vis-a-vis?
Moment of truth to deepen integration or lose risk losing irrelevance, losing relevance.
So
sorry.
basically, ASEAN have to reach a moment where you either have to deepen integration.
Oh yes,
or
yes.
you lose your relevance.
Right.
So
Yes.
I think there's a question from this gentleman.
So hello, thank you for the talk. My name is Mike Wan. I'm currently interning at the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, the PCC. I wanted to ask kind of a question that's more kind of a real-life focus, because given that there's an unpredictable international relations or geopolitical environment such as the Russia-Ukraine war, the Gaza conflict, and South China Sea conflict, and this goes on. And given that there's the recent visit by the U.S. Defense Minister Pete Hegseth to Singapore, in which he called Southeast Asian countries to stand up to China, and then China, kind of condemned those comments. And how do you? I wanted to ask more about how would you kind of view? Do you think it's sustainable for Southeast Asian countries and Singapore included to maintain a non-biased, impartial view towards comments such as what the U.S. Defense Minister has stated, because it's becoming increasingly, as I should say, difficult for Southeast Asian countries or many countries around the world to adopt a more non-aligned and neutral perspective. And also, how do you foresee or how do you view Southeast Asian countries' foreign policy, and how do you think they should adapt given a more unpredictable geopolitical environment, especially with American hegemony? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, yes, I agree wholeheartedly with the statement by the Prime Minister. This is today, I think, it's one of those critical junctures where the ASEAN is called upon to discard any sense of business as usual, but to reflect on the challenges before it. There are other similar moments in the past, I think, when ASEAN find itself in a juncture where then they had to qualitatively adjust and even transform the nature of its cooperation. For instance, when ASEAN launched the ASEAN community building process in 2002-2003. At the time, much like today, perhaps we can arguably say nothing was broken, in terms of ASEAN cooperation per se, but we felt that the world was undergoing through a very important period of transformation, the greater role of China, of India as economic powerhouses. So we, as ASEAN at the time, we felt the need to enhance the level of our cooperation from an association to become a community if we are to maintain our the attraction and the advantages that ASEAN enjoyed. Now, it's important to hear what the Prime Minister said, because sometimes there is always the risk that we buy in too excessively to our own rhetorics. Because of course, ASEAN, naturally, we speak to the world to project our confidence, to say ASEAN matter, ASEAN is incredibly important, etc., to our third-party colleagues, third-party partners. But when it's between ourselves, in the confine of ASEAN family, we have to be crystal clear and brutally honest in assessing where we are and to ensure that we are fit for purpose for the challenges to come. It's great that ASEAN adopted the 2045 vision statement, and it's quite important as well that Singapore will be taking up ASEAN chairmanship in 2027, the 60th year of ASEAN's founding. So it will be important for ASEAN to ensure that it is fit for purpose. But I hope, to be frank, I haven't read the full text of the vision statement, but I hope there is a description or projection, anticipation of how the world and the region would look like in the next 20 years, and make sure that we are actually not only responsive to it, but we anticipate the challenges. But spot on, it was quite refreshing for me, to be honest, to be frank, to hear a leader of the region to have to be as candid and open in recognizing that we are at a moment of truth, at a key juncture, obituary on ASEAN has been written many times over. There have been other moments in the past when people say, okay, that's it, that's the end of ASEAN. But somehow we managed to reinvent ourselves and emerge stronger. And often crisis, 2008, 1998, 1999, the financial crisis, and 2008 as well, often crises tend to become the trigger that really focus ASEAN's attention and be engaged in a transformative moment. So I hope the current situation with that requisite leadership can lead to higher quality ASEAN cooperation. Our colleague, I think, made references to the geopolitical competition and
basically, I think what he's trying to say is that whether ASEAN can continue to take an approach of not choosing.
Yes, of course, yes.
And take approach of focusing on our centrality and long-term interests in the midst of this. Like what you say about deterrence.
I think so. Because as I said before, the geopolitical competition is not new for our region. It's something that we have had to deal with for decades. Where there is a challenge, in my view, is in the past, ASEAN have managed to ensure that the diversity of the foreign policy orientation within it becomes a source of its strength. In other words, we are able, because of our diversity, I don't use division, but the word division, but diversity, variation, enabled us to have a multi-pronged policy, essentially to be friends to all countries and become like a hub and have a convening power. But that same quality, if we do not treat it right, can also become a factor that divides us, actually, not just variation, that cause debilitation and us not able to have a common outlook and common perspective. So, I think we have to be, I like the fact that the Prime Minister of Malaysia in his remarks also used the term dynamic equilibrium in suggesting the posture that ASEAN should adopt in the face of geopolitical competition, because it's something that I have also espoused and strongly feel that we should manage. But I'm not so sure the appeal for greater defense spending, you know, I mean, that I'm not so sure, because there was an appeal, because our region is about common security, in my view, right? Not collective security, and we have managed to have enjoy common security at a level of resource allocation that is reasonably efficient. And I'm not so sure whether defense modernization, I get, but if it's, because defense procurement modernization can have a habit of developing into an action-reaction, almost like an arms race type of dynamic. And this is something that we have been freed of in Southeast Asia. I think we shouldn't tinker and allow like a slippery slope where in the end we somehow have more resources, more defense spending, but less security. I think we have our own ways of going about these things, yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that people do not appreciate about ASEAN is that despite its diversity, the countries has always been looking at the long-term interest. And when you look at long-term interests, actually there are a lot of overlapping interests among the nations in ASEAN to look for stability, peace, and development. And because it's looking at long-term interests, actually, while people think that, oh, because you have to go for consensus, it's very difficult to make decisions. But as all the member states look at only long-term interests, they find that there's actually a lot of overlapping, a lot of places of where you can feel consensus. And that's the reason why ASEAN like inclusivity. Because actually it's in the long-term interest of the region to have inclusivity. And then so you find that ASEAN does not like to choose. The only footnote that I have to not wanting to choose is perfectly sums up the general orientation of our region, but it shouldn't suggest passivity, as if we are therefore passive. We simply want to be in the middle. Correct. Because ASEAN's ambitions have been more than that. We have not only been not wanting to choose, but we have also been proactively developing norms and principles, code of behavior for our region, whether it be through the TAC, when we speak about having non-use of force in our region, a peaceful settlement of disputes, or the South China Sea process. It's all about creating predictable behavior through norms and principles. Yes. I'm always, my wish, if I have a wish, is that we can come up with a treaty of non-aggression in Southeast Asia. Yeah. Why not? Yeah. If you think aggression is the threat, the solution to it doesn't always have to be country first defense procurement deterrence. We can have treaty binding commitment against aggression. Yes. Non-aggression treaty, much like TAC for the wider region. Yeah. Then we deal with the crisis, unintended type of conflict, make a crisis management capacity that is now missing in our part of the world. I mean, like now between Thailand and Cambodia, there's some border issues. Is there anyone actually thinking about this, or is it something that is purely bilateral, for instance? But anyway, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure ASEAN is thinking about it. As I said, it's the long-term interest of all nations, all the member states, to promote peace and stability in the region. And I think it's also, like what Pak Marty said, very misunderstood that ASEAN don't take position. I think ASEAN always find common position in all the issues. And I think that's always been very misunderstood. Question from the audience. I think we have another 10 minutes. Yes, I think the gentleman has a question.
Hi, thank you, Pak Marty. Joel Ng from RSIS. Good to hear you again. I wanted to ask you, at the last ASEAN summit, Prime Minister Wong also mentioned that there's the CPTPP, and he invited ASEAN members to consider joining, those who are not already members. Would Indonesia, what do you think is the potential for Indonesia to participate in this? And secondly, there was also, of course, the ASEAN Gulf and China summit. What do you make of this dynamic, and does it help to get your national, regional, global nexus kick-started? Thank you.
Let's take one more before.
Thank you. Selamat sore, Pak Marty. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very insightful. My name is Gilang Kembara. I'm also from CSIS. I want to unpack one of your statements regarding the headwinds of multilateralism, regarding the non-state actors and how they can also play a part as issues are no longer confined within the boundaries of states. Now, we see that there are a number of high-level private actors that are, transcending beyond their desires, such as Elon Musk. You have Sam Altman. You have all these private individuals. How do we ensure that most of these individuals and also upcoming, private members, private individuals, we can bring together into the conversation and ensure that some of their ideas can still be somewhat tethered down to the issues at hand and not getting their heads up in the cloud? And something that I can probably want to segue a bit into that is also whether we can tap into these non-state actors for, you mentioned also resources constraint, whether they can also play a part to sustain multilateral engagements, whether in Southeast Asia or in any other part of multilateral institutions. Thank you.
If I can take the last question first, while I still remember. Yeah, precisely, Pa, this is something that I feel that there is a bit of a lacune gap in terms of ideas and governance. There are two gaps that I speak of before. One is to come up with a multilateral governance that has adaptive capacity, that recognizes that there are power dynamics change, power constellations constantly evolve, and therefore we must think of a multilateral governance that has an automatic adaptive capacity, allowing that for some issues, some countries are more prominent, on other issues, other countries are less, etc. So that's one homework. The other one is the type that you were saying, this international global perspective. The international is of the traditional type. We assume that all issues that are cross-border in nature are to be addressed through interstate modality. When in fact, and this is a proposition I'd like to make, that many issues, whether in terms of impact or in terms of solution, has solution especially, has the role of non-state actors to be facilitated, to be empowered. How this is done, because I come from the more traditional type, where I see these things has to be channeled through the state. So basically, typically in an international meeting, whoever you want to contribute, the non-state actors, you go through your own national delegation. So the national delegation, before they go to a conference, they have a process of getting inputs about national positions and be co-opted or be adopted as a state position. But in some cases, there could be a direct role of actual NGOs and other state experts directly at the meeting itself. I mean, I remember when we had the discussion on the ICC, for instance, International Criminal Court, when we were negotiating that, there was and also on disarmament issues, there's also strong presence of non-governmental stakeholders. One care or footnote that I have is that sometimes, because of resource constraint, there is a risk that opening up doors to non-state actors can amplify the north-south divide between the resource rich and the resource poor, because sometimes it's not all non-state actors can be as active in multilateral negotiations or processes because they are not suitably resourced, right? So there is a risk that the richer countries have like a double dip. They have their official delegation and they have their additional stakeholders thing. So to be frank, I only have question, which I think is well worth thinking about on these two homework in my mind. One is this a flexible, adaptive type of governance, and the other one is flexible in terms of international. The first flexible type is within the international perspective, basically flexible vis-a-vis countries who can come in and out dependent on the issue. The other one is flexible, that's even more broader. It becomes global rather than international, where we think about other actors other than the state. Our colleague on Indonesia, I think one was on CPT. How do you say it even? Yes. On that one, Indonesia, I think, has indicated an interest to join, which is quite a significant shift, I think, in terms of its traditional posture, because traditionally Indonesia has always placed greater emphasis on RCEP, because that has been our main instrument for the region, and that ASEAN owned, ASEAN initiated, but apparently now we are less preoccupied in simply relying on the ASEAN modality. So that is to be promoted. And I think this is akin to the first question that we heard about complementarity of regional geographic or multilateral that's functional, that's beyond the specific sub-region. It's all about synergizing the various processes. Yes.
I think also partly, as you said earlier on, some of this militarization, whether RCEP or CPTPP, one of the key, the region has always to be inclusive. The membership is not fixed. Yeah. Even UK thinking about joining the CPTPP and other countries. So I think this is really one good methods we can say, that i.e. whatever organization, it cannot be an exclusive one. Yeah. It should always be an inclusive one. Of course, new members, their own calculation, they will join, but the door is always kept open for new members to join.
One process that I thought quite important and potentially relevant today is actually the East Asia Summit, because we have with the tariff issue at hand, and the fact that East Asia Summit is one of the few, if not the only, leaders level process that include both China and the United States within it. I would have thought useful for the summit, the East Asia Summit, to be invoked earlier than the formal meeting to be had at the end of the year, because the issue of the tariffs, for instance, is a very real one of today, of the current period, and it would be more demonstrate relevance if the East Asia Summit can be invoked earlier rather than at the end of the year. But those are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share. I should have begun earlier, and I want to end before we end by thanking very much our colleagues at the RSIS, not only for the convening of this discussion, but also for welcoming me the recent past to RSIS to enable me to think about many issues. But multilateralism, my main point that I was trying to make is that while it is facing headwinds, we in Southeast Asia, we have quite a body of experience that we can share with the rest of the world on the multilateral approach to international affairs. Thank you.
Well, let me also take this opportunity to thank Marty for sharing your very insightful thoughts with us this afternoon. It's very difficult to find in a single person one with such scholastic ability, and as well as lots of policy-making experience, both in UN, multilateral organization, and as a foreign minister. It's very difficult for us to find a single person that encompasses all this quality. And so may I just take this opportunity that all of us to put our hands together to thank Marty for spending this afternoon with us. Thank you very much.